Welcome to the Marginal Revolution Podcast. We're going to be talking about the 1970s. Now, if you think about the 1970s, I think the first thing that comes to mind is disco, but the second thing is inflation. And we don't know much about disco, do we, Tyler?
Well, speak for yourself.
Okay, yeah, right. I wasn't there in New York, but maybe you were at the clubs. But we do know maybe a little bit about inflation. So let's see. Inflation absolutely did take off in the 1970s. By 1974, inflation was 12.5%. And by the end of the 1970s, it had hit as high as 15%. And the question is, why? Why did inflation take off at this period of time?
The 1970s is an especially interesting decade to me because it seems to be the time when we Americans just did everything wrong, right? So productivity growth goes down the toilet, inflation is high, there's a lot of political disorder, a president has to resign. Is there any unity behind these trends? And as you know, we'll be doing a few other podcasts talking about other aspects of the 70s. But one thing that struck me, I was reading a book recently called The American Economy in Transition, edited by Martin Feldstein, published 1980. There's a paper in there by Milton Friedman, which I think must have been from 79. And Milton says he despairs that we're going to attack inflation until it reaches at least 25%.
Right.
Now, that was an incorrect prediction, and a lot of this podcast today will be about incorrect predictions. But what was it Milton got wrong in saying that?
Yeah, I think one of the surprising things is that the public actually hates inflation more than economists do, or more than economists expected. And that's the one thing which has kept inflation at bay. So we'll be talking about, there were lots of reasons for inflation, but the thing pushing back was really the public.
And I think in part, Friedman may have been influenced by the experience of Israel, which had rates of inflation. I don't remember the numbers, but I remember 40% and then higher. And they finally got that under control. And then there were Latin American experiments where inflation had to run very high before it got under control. And just some differences between these countries. Somehow his model didn't have enough cultural richness to see that, maybe. I suppose that would be my best explanation of what he got wrong. What do you think?
Possibly. Let's go back a little bit earlier and talk about, when inflation started and what were some of the causes. And then maybe we'll come back and talk about what Milton Friedman got wrong and why it didn't get worse than it actually
because it just seemed to be getting worse and worse for quite a long period of time.
Yeah. And then
maybe he had recency bias.
Right. Yeah, sure. That makes total sense. And the politics were all pushing towards more inflation. So I'm surprised we didn't get more inflation. And as I said, I think the public just hates it.
I was surprised at the time when Volcker did everything he did. I was like, whoa, I was not expecting this.
Yeah, we took big costs to reduce inflation.
That's right.
Yeah. But now we're getting ahead of ourselves. So let's go back and look at the beginnings of inflation. And I actually would blame inflation on the Keynesians, okay? And I would blame it on the Kennedy-Johnson tax cuts of 1962 and 1964. Now, not because these tax cuts themselves were inflationary, but rather because these tax cuts were really the first truly Keynesian fiscal policy in U.S. history. Now, Keynes had argued, of course, in 1936 in the General Theory that we should use deficit financing to combat a recession, the Great Depression. But really, in the United States at the time, the idea of a balanced budget, that still had held sway among both Republicans and Democrats. So a government might run a deficit, in a recession, but that was sort of accidental, right? Your taxes go down, your spending stays the same, you run a deficit. But then they would run surpluses, right, to pay down the debt. And you had a war, okay? So your spending goes up, but then you pay down. You have surpluses, okay? Surpluses were the norm, right? Frugality and prudence were sort of the words of the day. Then along comes Kennedy, right? And Kennedy, the new Camelot, the new guy, okay, the young guy, he brings the new economics, right? He brings the new economics to the White House. He brings people like Waller Heller, James Tobin, Robert Solow, future Nobel Prize winners, okay? And Tobin, a future Nobel Prize winner, he argues that one of the big goals of the new economics was to get rid of the taboo on deficit spending. And Walter Heller, Okay, he was in charge of all this. He says, John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson stand out as the first modern economists of the American presidency. Their administrations were largely free of the old mythology and wrong-headed economics, which had viewed government deficits as synonymous with inflation, government spending increases as a likely source of depressions, and government debts as an immoral burden on our grandchildren. All of that is gone. All of that is gone, okay? So what happens? Well, there's two problems. In theory, right, Keynesian's policy is supposed to be countercyclical. Increase spending and cut taxes during a recession, and cut spending and raise taxes during a boom. But of course, politicians, they only like half of this rule. What politician wants to raise taxes and cut spending? So my view of what generated the inflation of the 1970s is that the politicians took from the Keynesian economists this idea that spending increases and tax cuts could stimulate an economy, and they just ran with it, and they didn't stop.
But wait, I like these tax cuts, so let me try to defend them.
All right.
First, they had some positive supply side effects, over-exaggerated by the supply siders themselves. But there's always something to be said for better incentives, right? That's the first lesson of economics. But the key point, I think, is about geopolitics and also the collapse of Bretton Woods. So if you're moving from a world where the dollar is partly backed by gold in a complicated way to a world of fiat currency, you're going to have higher inflation rates, right? If you think of John Cochran, fiscal theory of the price level, you don't have to buy the whole theory to see a dollar that is less backed by commodities is going to be worth less in the equilibrium one way or the other.
Sure.
So you're going to get there. The problem under Bretton Woods for such a long time was there's just a dollar shortage in the world. US dollar was, is, and should be the global reserve currency. So you need to come up with a way of supplying more liquidity to the world. And T-bills are that. They're a form of dollars for the world. So the United States should run a deficit to boost the supply of liquidity. I think that's an old Michael Woodford argument, if memory serves. And it's just inevitable. Otherwise, the global economy is just choked off by not having enough dollar-based assets.
So I agree with what you say about the collapse of Bretton Woods, but I see that as a further Keynesian idea to get rid of the old bugaboos and the old taboos. You know, gold is, what was Keynes's term?
Barbarous relic. But look,
barbarous relic.
We had to get rid of the gold standard.
No, we did not. No,
it's not an accident that it collapsed.
No. It definitely wasn't an accident. No, it was done on purpose. And it was done on purpose so that the politicians could further stimulate the economy. So you think about all of the things which were holding them back. One of them was this idea of prudence and frugality. And then the Keynesians come along and it's like Chesterson's fence, right? And they say, oh, what's this fence doing here? We don't need that, okay? They didn't understand what the fence was in the first place. And the purpose of the fence was to hold back the political inclinations to spend more and to try and stimulate the economy to win re-election. So you got rid of the prudence and frugality, and then you got rid of the gold standard, which was also holding them back. So that was like the second fence, which was eliminated.
Look, I don't like the Keynesians, but Friedman, for one, was very happy to see the gold standard go. Had we stayed on the gold standard, given subsequent volatility in the price of gold, there would have been phenomenal macroeconomic volatility. And in fact, we would have just cut the tie anyway. It was never going to last, but there was this fundamental contradiction that Europe in particular relied on the US to keep on increasing the supply of dollars because there was a sort of dollar shortage over there and it was their reserve currency. The other economies weren't strong enough and there was no euro. Yet at the same time, the dollar was to be convertible into gold. So in the short run, we solved, quote unquote, that problem by just twisting the arms of them, especially the French, and saying, we're not actually going to let you convert your dollars into gold, and we're going to keep on sending you dollars. And at some point, the French just said, like, no way. And they started converting, and the thing collapsed. But there was never a way